Move the question be now put.
The question is that the question be now put. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party votes called for. Party vote called for.
New Zealand National.
59 votes opposed.
New Zealand Labour.
32 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
12 votes in favour.
Māori Party.
2 votes opposed.
Act New Zealand.
1 vote opposed.
United Future.
1 vote opposed.
Members, the ayes are 58, the noes are 63. The motion is not agreed to. I call Paul Foster-Bell.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and I take great pleasure in rising to take a brief contribution in this committee stage of the Christchurch City Council Rates Validation Bill. Sir, I have a couple of comments to make, but I do actually have a question for the Minister, which I hope at some point she may be able to address. But my specific point that I wanted to make actually references comments that have been made in this debate already by the Honourable Member Major Ron Mark from the New Zealand First Party. And in response to some of the things Ron Mark said, I have to say I share his view that this committee works together very well in a collegial way under the able and eminent chairmanship of the Honourable Member Scott Simpson, the member for the Coromandel. So it has been a bill that, although none of us want to have to deal with such an issue, it has been a bill that we've worked our way through in a calm, considered and consistent manner, listening to the views from the only submitter on this bill, which was the Christchurch City Council, and we have come up with a pragmatic solution to the issues that were faced due to the incorrect charging of rates over a period of years. So, sir, I would like to refer to the preamble of the bill, recital 2, sections A through to I, little Roman 2, which refers specifically to the time frame over the period over which rates were incorrectly charged. Now, this is an issue that's come up before in the course of discussion around this bill, but one of the key elements that distinguish this bill from many of the others that we see is that it contains a large degree of retrospectivity. That is, it has a retroactive effect. And we've previously discussed the pros and cons of such a state of affairs. In fact, I believe last time I referred to the great British legal theoretician A.V. Dicey, who was an Oxford Vinerian professor of law, who debated about the different benefits and consequences of having retrospective clauses in legislation. And this, however, sir, I think would fit Dicey's definition of a curative provision in this bill, because it sets right a wrong. It's not entirely a victimless crime, which I think was a term used by the Green Party member Eugenie Sage. And in fact, the Minister herself might have used that term. It's not entirely victimless, as there are some affected parties, but it certainly isn't by writing this technical failure made by council staff and advisors and councils themselves in the resolutions they passed over a very long period of time. In writing this wrong, it is restoring the state of affairs that should have existed had everything been properly done, and there are no real victims to this change that is being proposed in this piece of legislation. And, well, look, I want to single out in particular the sponsoring member as a private bill, a local bill to Christchurch, but also a bill brought forward by the local member, the Honourable Nikki Wagner. I think she is an excellent, very hard-working, very assiduous member who's brought us a simple and clear and concise but very well-formed piece of legislation that does exactly what needed to be done. The question I suppose I have for the Minister or the sponsoring member and the Chair comes to the specific detail around what we are actually retrospectively validating. Right. And the question that I have is to whether the Uniform Annual General Charge can be, and if the member has any information on this, whether the Uniform Annual General Charge that has been retrospectively validated, what kind of a proportion that amount is compared to the 7 other targeted rates that are being retrospectively validated. Because I'm not, I mean, it's certainly something we went through in the committee, but I'm still not entirely clear about the scale of the Uniform Annual General Charge retrospective validation compared and contrasted with the 7 other targeted rates, which I think encompass issues such as water and drainage board rates. So if there was an opportunity to hear from the sponsoring member on that, I would certainly welcome that. But the other question that we had in committee and that we asked the council, who were the only submitters on this bill, when we were going through line by line and analysing each clause of this bill, it wasn't exactly the tone, I think, of response, in my perception, that the Honourable Ron Mark, Mr Chair.
Paul Foster Bill.
Thank you, sir. It wasn't exactly the tone of response that Mr Mark detected, and that I didn't quite see arrogance, but I certainly saw a slight dismissiveness in the reaction in terms of taking accountability and responsibility for these mistakes that were made in the past, as referenced in the preamble of this piece of legislation. But the question I have is around whether this can happen again and whether the validating legislation was absolutely necessary, given the Council has corrected this in their own internal processes to make sure that, in their own case anyway, in their locality, we're not going to see such an issue arise again in the future. And what we heard from the Council, sir, did contain elements of dismissiveness, elements of perhaps pushing the blame onto staff who were no longer in their offices within the City Council today, and acknowledging that this has been an ongoing problem for many, many years, in fact going back to 2003, throughout the periods of tenure of 2 different governments of the realm of New Zealand, and certainly different council laws and council officials have cycled through that organisation over that time period. But I was somewhat taken aback that there was not an entire degree of acceptance that the fault was with the council for not having followed what are clear provisions in the basic legislation that councils are required to enforce and to carry out under section 119 of the council rating legislation. And whilst it's pleasing to see that this has been remedied, I think there were a number of members on the committee, including clearly Mr Mark from his comments, but I think others, and particularly on this side of the House, who weren't entirely pleased to see a council not taking full responsibility for its past conduct. Whilst it's absolutely imperative that we do pass this legislation to correct the situation which exists and to make sure that those $600,000 worth or so of retrospectively unpaid rates that currently can't be legally collected because they weren't correctly levied in the first place, to make sure that those $600,000 worth can be corrected. I would be very interested to hear from the Minister in the Chair, the sponsoring member of this bill, if there was any information that she might be able to provide the House around the breakdown of the annual Uniform General Charge versus the 7 other targeted rates, just so we can get an idea of their relative scale. Other than that small question, so I think this is an excellent, well-drafted piece of legislation. Whilst it's retrospective, it doesn't have any of the monstrous effects of retrospective legislation such as the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act 1792, which I think is held up by many as the gravest example of an evil piece of retrospective legislation. And for that reason, sir, I take enormous pleasure in commending it to the House and hope to hear contributions from others on the other side of the House who so seldom allow a bandwagon to pass them without jumping on board. So let's actually have, rather than having a curtailed debate, rather than having, sir, democracy crushed in this House by an opposition who wants to silence debate on an issue that I think we all agree on. Let's hear a meaningful, useful and decent contribution from opposition members. Mr Mark did a very good job and I just wish the Labor members could do the same.